The whole town called it the weird stove shed, a crazy veteran, a limping German shepherd with amber eyes and a stack of dry firewood taller than the door of the shed itself. They laughed at Jax Harlan in the aisles of Dunlap's feed. They laughed at him at the gas pumps. They told their children not to stare at the man who talked to his dog more than he talked to people. Then the storm came, and the power died across 3 counties, and the gas lines froze solid for 6 straight weeks, 30 below zero, then 35 below. Only one chimney in that whole valley kept on smoking. Only one house stayed warm, and the people who had mocked him the loudest were the first ones pounding on his door. Before we continue, tell us in the comments where you're watching from today. The cabin sat high on the east ridge above Silver Creek, Montana, a low, dark shape hunched against the winter sky like a sleeping animal that had not moved in 40 years. It had belonged to Jax Harlan's grandfather, and before that to his great-grandfather. And it had passed down through a chain of stubborn men who had all understood one thing about the land up there. The land did not forgive softness. It did not forgive assumptions. It did not forgive the kind of modern belief that a switch on a wall or a valve in a pipe would always turn on when a man needed it to. The men in Jax's family had built their lives on the opposite assumption. They had built the cabin with their own hands out of lodgepole pine and river stone, and they had buried a spring line deeper than the frost would ever reach, and they had cut and stacked their firewood 2 full years ahead of the winter they intended to burn it in, because they understood that the mountain did not owe any of them a single warm night. Jax woke every morning at 4:30 without the use of an alarm clock. His body knew the hour, the way a dog knows its owner's footstep on the stairs. He sat up in the narrow cot against the north wall, and he put his bare feet down on the cold, rough boards of the cabin floor, and he breathed in once deeply through his nose. The inside of the cabin smelled of pine pitch and old iron, and the faint sweet ash of a fire that had banked itself down through the long quiet hours before dawn. It was a good smell. It was the smell of a place where nothing had gone wrong yet. Smokey lifted her head from the braided rug by the wood stove and watched him. She did not stand. She did not whine. She simply opened her amber eyes in the half-dark, and she watched, because that was what she had always done, and because there was nothing else in the room that needed her attention more than the man she had come home with. Her thick double coat was silvered at the muzzle now, and her left hind leg carried the permanent hitch of the shrapnel wound that had ended her working life overseas. She was 11 years old. She moved a little slower than she once had. She missed nothing. Jax pulled on his wool socks and his canvas trousers and the flannel shirt he had worn the day before and the day before that, and he laced his combat boots with the muscle memory of a man who had laced the same kind of boots in the dark 10,000 times. He shrugged on the military surplus jacket with the fraying cuffs and the oil stain over the right breast pocket that no amount of washing had ever lifted. Then he opened the cabin door and stepped out into the cold. The cold took him in its teeth. It always did. Montana cold in late October had a specific character to it that people who had not lived through one could never quite understand. It was not a cold that numbed a man slowly. It was a cold that announced itself the instant a man crossed the threshold, a cold that drew every drop of moisture out of the exposed skin of his face in a single breath, a cold that pressed through wool and leather and flannel and found the living body underneath and began its patient, steady work of trying to stop the heart. Jax stood on the porch for a long moment, and he let the cold find him, and he let his lungs adjust to it, and he listened. He listened the way a soldier listens. He did not hear with his ears alone. He heard with the old muscles across his upper back, with the hairs on the backs of his forearms, with the small, fine nerves at the base of his skull that had been trained over 12.5 years of foreign deployments to register the difference between a sound that was supposed to be there and a sound that was not. The ridge was quiet. The wind was moving steady and low through the pines across the draw. A raven called once from somewhere down toward the creek. The valley below was still dark. There were no sounds that did not belong. Smokey came out through the door behind him and sat down at his left heel, without a word being spoken. She always sat at his left heel. She had done so since the first week he had brought her back from the military veterinary hospital in San Antonio, where she had been released to him in a steel cage, with her discharge papers stapled to the bars and a plastic bag of her gear around her neck. That had been almost 4 years ago now. She had not left his left side for any meaningful length of time in all 4 of those years. She did not need to. Jax walked down the porch steps and across the frozen yard to the shed. The shed sat about 30 yards from the cabin, low and long and dark, roofed in old tin that he had pulled off a collapsed barn down near the highway and hammered straight by hand. He had built the shed himself the first summer he had come back to the ridge, working alone with a circular saw run off a gasoline generator and a pile of rough lumber he had traded for. He had built it around a very specific idea. He had built it around a stove. The rocket stove sat at the back of the shed, against the north wall, squat and ugly and entirely functional. Jax had welded it together over the course of a single long weekend out of 2 discarded propane tanks, a length of 8-inch stovepipe and a heavy steel plate he had salvaged from a demolished grain elevator down in Billings. The design was an old one. It was older than the men in Jax's family. It was older than Montana. It was a design that people in Southeast Asia and Central America had been using for 150 years to cook rice and boil water and keep the small bones of their children from freezing in the night, because they had never had the luxury of assuming that a valve in a pipe would always turn on. The rocket stove burned hot, it burned clean, it burned on fuel no bigger around than a man's wrist. It put out enough heat from a handful of dry pine sticks to warm a shed the size of Jax's shed for 6 straight hours, and if a man built it right and fed it right and understood what he was doing with it, it would keep him alive through a night that wanted very badly to kill him. Jax opened the shed door and stepped inside. The air in the shed was markedly warmer than the air outside. The residual heat from the previous day's fire had soaked into the river stone he had laid as thermal mass along the base of the north wall, and that stone was still radiating gently, slowly, patiently. He took off his gloves and he laid his bare palm flat against the nearest stone, and he felt the warmth of it sink into his hand, and some small tight knot somewhere between his ribs loosened by a fraction of an inch. That was what the stone did. That was what the stove did. That was what the shed did. It gave him a place where the world was not actively trying to kill him. There were not very many places like that left in his life. He crossed the shed to the wood stacks along the west wall. The stacks ran floor to ceiling and wall to wall, too deep in places, all of it split and dried and sorted by size and species, lodgepole pine on the bottom courses for long, slow burns, dry tamarack on the upper shelves for high heat, aspen in a separate pile near the door for kindling, split fine enough to catch from a single spark. There were almost 8 full cords of wood in the shed. There were another 6 cords stacked under a tarp against the south side of the cabin, seasoned since the summer before last. There was a third stack, smaller, of round unsplit pieces out behind the tool lean-to, set aside for emergencies in a year he hoped would not come. The wife he had once had would have called this paranoia. The men at Dunlap's feed had a different word for it. They had several different words for it, actually, and they used those words whenever they thought Jax could not hear them, and a few times, even when they knew full well that he could. He carried an armload of sticks to the stove, he opened the steel door, and he laid a handful of aspen shavings on the bed of fine ash, and he struck a single match, and he watched the small orange flame take hold. He fed it patiently, the way a man feeds a wounded thing back toward life. 3 slim sticks of aspen, then 4 sticks of pine, then a single split of tamarack laid across the top when the bed was hot enough to take it. The stove began to draw. He could hear the draw through the chimney pipe, a low, steady, hollow sound, the sound of a small, controlled burn reaching for oxygen and finding it. The sound was the sound of a thing that was working. A man who had spent his working life making sure that the equipment around him was working learned to love that sound more than music. Smokey padded into the shed behind him and lay down on her blanket by the thermal mass. She put her head down on her paws. She watched the fire. He stood there in the soft, growing warmth of the shed for longer than he had intended to. He did that sometimes. He would stand with his hands held open to the face of the stove, and he would let the heat push against his palms, and for a few minutes the inside of his head would go almost quiet, and he could almost believe that he was going to be all right. Almost. Then he thought about the mail. There had been a letter in the box at the end of the drive 3 days ago. It had been from a law firm in Billings. He had not opened it. He did not need to. He already knew what it said. It said the same thing that the last letter had said, and the letter before that, and every other piece of correspondence that had arrived on thin, crisp paper with a firm's name embossed across the letterhead in a font designed to look important. It said that the divorce had been finalized. It said that the marital home had been sold. It said that the proceeds of the sale had been dispersed according to the terms of the settlement that Jax had not contested, because he had been lying in a military hospital bed at the time of the hearing with a traumatic brain injury and a splintered left shoulder and a mind that could not process more than one sentence in a row without stuttering to a full stop. It said that the joint accounts had been closed. It said that his name had been legally removed from the title to his own truck. It said that there was nothing more to discuss. He had discussed nothing. He had signed the papers. He had signed them with a ballpoint pen in a hospital bed, with his chaplain and a VA caseworker standing on either side of him and telling him in soft voices that he did not have the bandwidth right now to fight this, that he needed to rest, that he needed to focus on his recovery, that there would be time later to sort out the finances. There had been no time later. There had not been a single thing left to sort out. The woman he had married had made very sure of that. He did not think her name in his head anymore. He had trained himself out of it. The way a man trains himself out of a dangerous habit, by simple repetition and unbroken discipline. When the name tried to surface, he replaced it with a simpler thought. He thought about the grain of the wood in the shed wall. He thought about the draw of the stove. He thought about the weight of Smokey against his left heel. He thought about the next cord of wood he needed to split. He thought about any of those things, and he kept thinking about them until the names sank back down to wherever names go when a man has refused them long enough. He went back out into the cold. He went to the chopping block behind the shed, and he set a round of pine on the block, and he raised the splitting maul, and he brought it down in one smooth, unbroken motion. The round split cleanly. He set up the next round. He brought the maul down again. The rhythm took him. The cold moved off his face as his body warmed. His breath came steady and even. Smokey lay on the near side of the chopping area, with her head on her paws and her amber eyes half closed, tracking him without seeming to, her ears turning slightly at every sound the forest made. He split wood for an hour and a half. He stacked the new splits in a fresh row along the south side of the cabin, under the deep eaves where the snow could not reach. He counted the cords under his breath as he worked, because counting was a thing he had learned to do in the army, and he had never stopped doing it. He counted rounds of ammunition, and liters of water, and nautical miles of line of sight, and now he counted cords of seasoned firewood against the hard mathematics of a Montana winter, and the numbers told him what they told him. He had enough wood for a winter. He had enough wood, if he was careful with it, for a winter and a half. He had enough wood. If the winter turned bad in the particular way that Jax had watched the sky for all summer, and been quietly sure was coming, to keep himself and his dog alive for as long as they needed to stay alive. The men at Dunlap's feed did not share his opinion about the coming winter. They did not share very many of his opinions. He went into town around 9:30 in the morning. He went to town once a week, on Tuesdays, and he always went at the same time. And he always bought the same things, and he always spoke to the same small handful of people he had to speak to in order to complete his errands. The drive into Silver Creek took 22 minutes down the county road and across the low bridge over the creek itself. He drove the old two-tone Chevy pickup that had been his father's and before that his grandfather's, and he had Smokey up in the cab next to him on the bench seat, and he kept the radio off because he did not like the radio. The radio had voices on it. The voices said things he did not want to hear. He parked the truck at the curb outside Dunlap's Feed and Supply on Main Street, and he clipped Smokey's lead to her collar, and the two of them walked in together through the steel-framed front door. The bell overhead rang once as the door swung closed behind them. 5 heads turned to look. They always turned. There was a small knot of men who stood every weekday morning around the coffee pot by the register, and they had been standing there around that same coffee pot for as long as Jax had been coming to the feed store, and they would still be standing there around it long after Jax was dead, and they looked at him exactly the same way every single time he walked in. They did not look at him with hostility. Hostility would have been a cleaner thing to bear. They looked at him the way a man looks at a piece of furniture that is not quite level. A piece of furniture that is almost but not entirely right, a piece of furniture that somebody else really ought to do something about one of these days. The tallest of the men was Roger Halden. Roger was 56 years old, and he had sold insurance in Silver Creek for 29 years. And on the side he bought up parcels of land on the edges of town from people who were tired or dying or bankrupt. And he held those parcels until a developer from Bozeman or Missoula came through with an offer, and then he sold the parcels at a profit, and he went back to selling insurance. Roger wore a Carhartt barn coat over a pressed button-down shirt, and his wallet made a visible rectangular shape in the right back pocket of his jeans. He had been trying for almost 2 years now to convince Jax Harlan to sell him the cabin on the East Ridge, and Jax had refused him every single time, and Roger had made it very clear in a number of small ways that he found the refusal personally insulting. Roger looked up from his coffee cup. His mouth moved in the small, tight, private smile he saved for these occasions. "Morning, stove freak," he said. He said it at a volume that was calibrated exactly. It was not loud enough to be a provocation. It was not quiet enough to be a private remark. It was pitched to carry across the length of the feed store so that Elmer Dunlap behind the register could hear it, and so that Dean Peterson over by the horse tack could hear it, and so that the 2 farmhands up on ladders in the back hauling feed sacks could hear it. Every single person in the store could hear it. Every single person in the store did hear it. No one said anything at all. Jax did not answer. He had stopped answering a long time ago. He walked past Roger to the counter, and he put his list down in front of Elmer, and he stood and waited. Elmer would not quite meet his eye. Elmer never quite did. Elmer was not a bad man. Elmer was just a tired man who owned a feed store in a small town and who did not want trouble from Roger Halden, because Roger Halden had enough money in the bank to make trouble for a tired man who owned a feed store. Jax bought 50 pounds of high-protein kibble for Smokey, and a case of 24-hour candles, and a 2-gallon jug of kerosene, and a small canvas sack of assorted bolts, and a new pair of leather work gloves to replace the pair he had burned through splitting wood. The total came to $168.41. Jax paid in cash. He did not have a bank account. He had not had a bank account in 4 years. The cash came out of a leather billfold worn soft and thin from use, and the bills inside it were not many, and Jax paid out more than half of what was in there, and the billfold went back into the inside pocket of his jacket noticeably lighter than it had been. He loaded the kibble and the kerosene into the truck. Roger followed him out onto the sidewalk. "Gonna be a mild one this year, they're saying." Roger's voice was conversational now, the way a man's voice gets conversational when he is about to say something he does not actually mean. Farmer's Almanac, Weather Service, NOAA, all of them, mild winter coming, could be the warmest on record. Jax did not turn around. He kept loading the kibble into the bed of the truck. "Must be hard on a man like you," Roger said. "All that wood up there on the hill, all that gear, all that preparation, for a winter that's not even gonna show up." Smokey stood at Jax's left heel, with her amber eyes fixed on Roger Halden's face and her ears forward. She did not growl. She did not have to. The rigidity of her body said exactly what needed to be said, and Roger Halden felt it, and he did not step any closer. "Something to think about, Jax," Roger said. He smiled the tight private smile again. "Come around my office sometime. We can talk numbers on that property. Get you set up in a nice small place in town. Something with heat that turns on when you flick a switch, like normal people." Jax finished loading the truck. He opened the passenger door, and he gestured once with his right hand, and Smokey jumped up onto the bench seat and settled. He walked around to the driver's side. He opened the door. He paused there with one boot up on the running board, and he looked back at Roger Halden for the first time that morning, and he held Roger's eye for a 3 count without blinking. "The winter's coming, Roger," he said. His voice was low and even, and entirely without heat. "You have a good one." He climbed into the truck and he pulled the door closed, and he drove back out of town with Smokey, pressed warm against his right thigh, and the inside of his head was quieter than it had been in a week. Sometimes it went like that. Sometimes a man did not need to give a speech. Sometimes a man only needed to speak the truth one time in a clear voice, and then leave, and the speaking was enough, because the truth was going to do its own work on its own schedule, and no man alive was going to be able to stop it when the time came. He drove up the county road toward the ridge. The sky to the north had the color of a skinned animal. He noted it the way a man notes a change in a watch face. He did not comment. He did not speculate. He filed it against the other things he had been watching for 3 months, and he kept driving, and beside him on the bench seat, Smokey watched the road through the windshield with her amber eyes steady, and she did not turn her head, because there was nothing on that road that needed her attention yet. The first snow came on the 18th of November, and it came the way the real storms come in that part of Montana, without announcement and without apology. Jax was out at the woodpile when it started. He felt the first flakes touch the back of his neck, where the collar of his jacket did not quite reach, and he stopped splitting, and he stood there with the maul still in both hands, and he watched the sky. The sky had gone the color of old solder. The wind, which had been running low and steady out of the northwest for most of the afternoon, began to turn. It turned slowly at first, the way a large animal turns in a narrow stall, and then it settled into a new direction out of the north, and the flakes that had been single and wandering a moment earlier came down all at once in one continuous white sheet. He did not hurry. He had not been a man who hurried in a long time. He set the maul against the chopping block, and he carried the last armload of splits to the south stack, and he laid them carefully with the bark side up, and then he walked back to the cabin with Smokey at his left heel. And he stepped up onto the porch, and he took one long look at the falling snow before he opened the door. Inside, he put more wood on the cabin stove, he filled the big cast-iron kettle from the spring tap in the sink, and he set it on the flat top to heat. He checked the kerosene lanterns that hung on iron hooks at 4 points along the cabin walls, and he topped each of them off from the jug, and he trimmed each of the wicks with a small pair of scissors kept for that purpose in a jar on the mantel. He went down into the root cellar under the trap door in the kitchen floor, and he looked at the shelves of canned goods and the sacks of flour and rice and pinto beans, and he counted again, and the numbers again were the numbers he had expected. He came back up, he closed the trap door. He sat down in the chair by the stove with a cup of black coffee in his right hand, and Smokey lay down across his boots, and he listened to the wind through the chimney. The wind spoke a particular language. A man who had slept in enough bad places learned to read that language the way another man might read a weather map. The wind was saying a number of things. It was saying that the storm moving in was not going to be a weekend storm. It was saying that the storm had been built up for a long time in the cold high places of the Canadian interior, and was now loose and coming south with the full weight of its gathered momentum. It was saying that it had brothers behind it, and that the brothers would come one after the other, and that the space between them would not be long. Jax listened for a long while. Then he got up and he went to the battery-powered shortwave radio on the shelf, and he clicked it on, and he tuned it to the National Weather Service frequency out of Great Falls, and he listened to the automated voice read off advisories and warnings in the slow synthetic cadence of a machine that does not feel what it is saying. The voice said that a significant winter weather event was underway. It said that a low-pressure system had tracked down from the Arctic faster than models had predicted. It said that temperatures across the northern Rockies would fall to -25 degrees Fahrenheit overnight and continue falling across the following 72 hours. It said that travel was not recommended. It said that residents should prepare for potential disruptions to utility service. Potential disruptions to utility service. Jax knew what that language meant. It meant that the men who wrote the language had already known, before they wrote it, that the utilities were going to fail. They simply could not say it that way in print. The power went out at 2:17 in the afternoon on the following day. Jax was in the shed feeding the stove. The single bare bulb over the workbench dimmed, flickered, flared once, and went dark. He did not react. He finished what he was doing with the stove. He walked out into the snow, and he looked at the power line that ran from the pole at the county road up to the service drop on his cabin, and he saw what he had already known he would see. The line was sagging low. There would be ice on it further down the hollow, and there would be more ice on it as the night deepened, and somewhere out along the 15 miles of wire between his pole and the substation down by the highway, there was either a tree across the line already, or a tree about to come down across the line within the hour. He turned around and he walked back to the cabin, and he did not turn on any of the light switches, because there was no longer any reason to. And for the rest of the afternoon he moved through his rooms in the soft gray light of the snowstorm, with the quiet, unhurried motion of a man who had been preparing for this exact silence for most of his adult life. By dark the wind had doubled. By midnight, the temperature on the nail-driven thermometer beside the porch read 27 below zero. By dawn of the following day, there was 3.5 feet of new snow on the level, and drifts to the eaves on the north side of every building in the valley, and the county road was gone, and the driveway was gone, and the power was still out, and the phones were still out, and the cell towers down by the highway had been down since the first hour of the storm. Jax made coffee on the cabin stove. He ate oatmeal from a tin bowl. He fed Smokey her kibble, and he warmed her water on the edge of the stovetop to take the chill off it. He dressed in layers. He went outside to dig a path to the shed. He dug for 2 hours. He dug a narrow trench exactly the width of his shoulders and exactly as deep as the snow was deep. And he cut the walls of the trench clean with the flat of the shovel, and he pressed the snow to either side in a way that would not slump back in during the next round of wind. The trench went from the cabin porch to the shed door and branched once toward the outhouse and once toward the tool lean-to. He did not cut any trench he did not need. He was going to have to dig this trench again many times in the coming weeks. Every meter of trench he dug was a meter he would have to re-dig. He was not in a hurry. Economy of motion was the only economy that mattered now. The radio at noon said that the storm was stalled over the northern tier of the state. It said that power was out to more than 200,000 customers across 3 counties. It said that the Montana governor had declared a statewide emergency. It said that the National Guard had been activated but could not reach the affected areas until the storm cleared. It said that the storm would not clear for at least another 36 hours. It said the words reliable restoration of service cannot be estimated at this time. Jax listened to the radio, and he wrote the key pieces of information down in a small pocket notebook with a pencil stub. He had always written things down. The habit had kept him alive a number of times. He listed the counties affected. He listed the current temperature. He listed the estimated duration of the weather event. He listed the phrase reliable restoration of service cannot be estimated at this time. He closed the notebook and put it back in his breast pocket. The second storm arrived on the 4th day. It came in harder than the first, the way a second fist comes in harder than the first. And when it was done, the snow in the meadow was up to the belly of a standing horse, and the thermometer on the porch read 31 below. Smokey stopped going outside for anything except the quick necessary trips to the small area Jax had shoveled for her behind the outhouse. She stayed close to the stove. She watched him. It was on the 5th day that he heard the scream. He was in the shed. He had just put a fresh split of tamarack into the rocket stove, and he was bent down with his hands to the stove face and his mind in the simple quiet place it went when he was feeding a fire. Smokey was lying on her blanket against the thermal mass wall, her chin down on her front paws, her amber eyes half closed. She came up off the blanket so fast that for an instant, Jax could not remember her injury at all. She stood at the shed door with her ears up and her body still, and her nose was pointed slightly west, down toward the line of fence posts that marked the lower pasture. Jax straightened up. He did not ask her what it was. He had spent 9 months on active operations with a German shepherd who had been trained to detect hostile intent at 300 meters, and he had spent 4 years afterward with the same dog in civilian life, and he had long since stopped asking her to explain herself. He walked to the shed door and he stood behind her and he listened. It came on the second gust of wind. It came thin and torn, like a piece of paper caught in barbed wire, but it was unmistakable. It was a human voice. It was the voice of a woman. It was the sound a person makes when they are calling out for help and they already know the help is not coming. Jax said one low word that Smokey had been waiting for, and the two of them went. He moved with his head down against the wind, and his right shoulder leading because that was the shoulder the wind was angling at, and he moved with the long steady stride of a man who had covered long distances on foot in worse weather than this. Smokey ran ahead of him through the snow, favoring her left hind leg, but moving forward in the way that she always moved forward when Jax asked her to move, because that was what she did. The snow was up to Jax's thighs in places. He broke trail the old way, one boot at a time, rocking his weight forward with each step to pack the snow, and then pulling up the back foot to place it forward in the new hole. And the motion was a motion he had done 1,000 times in winter training rotations in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and once through a long night in the Korengal Valley in Afghanistan when all the maps had been wrong. The voice came again. It was closer now. It was down along the fence line where his property met the back of the old Haraway place, and there was no reason on earth for there to be a human voice in that location in a storm like this. And Jax knew with a certainty that settled into his chest like a small cold weight that something had gone very wrong for someone. He found her at the 4th fence post. She was on her knees in the snow with her arms wrapped around the post and her face turned up into the wind, and her hood had blown back from her head, and her hair was frozen to her face, and her skin was the color of wax, and she was about 25 years old, and she was unmistakably pregnant. The coat she wore was a thin down jacket of the kind that somebody who had moved to Montana from somewhere warmer might have bought, with no real understanding of what a Montana winter was going to require of that jacket. Her boots were wrong, her gloves were too thin. She should have been dead already. She was not dead, but she was close enough that Jax had to work not to think about how close she was. Smokey reached her first. Smokey circled her once, and then came back to Jax and looked up at him with her amber eyes, and then went back to the woman, and lay down against her side in the snow, pressing the whole length of her body along the woman's ribcage, putting what warmth she had into the woman without being asked. Jax knelt. He pulled off his outer glove, and he put the back of his bare hand against the woman's cheek. Her skin was so cold that the feel of it shocked through the nerves of his fingers. But there was a pulse in her throat. He could see the small beat of it under the waxen skin. Slow, but there. Her eyes came open. They were dark blue eyes. She looked at him without quite being able to focus. "My baby," she said. Her voice was a thread of sound. "Please, my baby." Jax did not speak. He took off his jacket. He wrapped it around her. He lifted her out of the snow in a single motion, and he cradled her the way a man cradles a live thing that is badly hurt, with her head against his shoulder and her weight balanced across both of his forearms, and he turned and he started back up the trench he had dug, and Smokey went ahead of him through the snow as his point, her amber eyes tracking every shift in the wind. Her old wounded body still doing, at 11 years of age, what it had been trained long ago to do. The cabin was 120 yards away. It took him 14 minutes to walk it. The whole way, he did not let himself think about the 3 words she had said. He did not let himself think about what they meant, or about who she might be, or about why in the name of God she was out alone in a storm of this kind, on foot along a fence line that led nowhere. He did not let himself think about any of it. He walked, he carried her, he did the one thing that could be done in this moment, and he kept doing it until the moment was finished. He reached the porch, he pushed the cabin door open with his boot, he carried her into the warm room, and the firelight from the cabin stove fell across her face, and he laid her down on the wool rug by the hearth, and he began to save her life. Jax worked fast, and he worked quiet. He had done cold weather casualty treatment in training, and he had done it in the field, and the hands knew what the hands needed to do without the mind having to ask. He did not rip her clothes off. Stripping a hypothermic patient too fast was one of the ways you killed them. He cut the wet outer layers off her torso with the old army folding knife he kept in the right breast pocket of his shirt, and he peeled the frozen scarf away from her throat, and he eased the wet boots off her feet and the wet socks after them. And he checked each of her fingers and each of her toes against the light of the stove for the dead white color that would tell him she had already lost something to the cold. She had not. Not yet. It had been close. It was still close. He wrapped her in wool. He had 3 wool blankets folded on the end of the cot against the north wall, and he used all 3 of them. He laid her on her side, in the recovery position on the rug by the stove, and he tucked the blankets around her, and he left her face and her throat clear, and he slid a folded jacket under her head. He went to the stove, and he poured warm water from the big kettle into an enameled tin cup, and he held the cup to her lips, and he let her take one small sip, and then another, slowly, because a cold body cannot handle much warm water all at once without going into shock. Her teeth chattered against the rim of the cup. Her dark blue eyes found his face and held on it. "My baby," she said again. Her voice was a little stronger now. "Is my baby—" "Your baby is all right," Jax said. He kept his voice low. He kept his voice even. "You're safe here. You're warm. Your baby is all right. Stay with me." She closed her eyes. She opened them again. She nodded once. Smokey had come in through the door with them, and she was now lying directly behind the woman's back, pressed flush against her from shoulder to hip, her amber eyes turned up toward Jax. Smokey was running her body temperature up into the woman's spine, and Jax knew from old field experience that the heat of a dog against a hypothermic torso was worth more than most of the medical supplies he did not have access to. He did not speak to her. He touched the top of her head once with the flat of his palm, and she thumped her heavy tail against the floor exactly once in answer, and he went to the stove to put on more water. The woman began to shiver. It was a hard, violent shivering that shook the blankets and the rug underneath her, and it was against all appearances the best possible sign. A cold body that could still shiver was a body that could still save itself. Jax stayed by the stove and he let her shiver. He did not try to stop it. He did not try to warm her faster. He fed another split of pine to the fire, and he waited for her body to do the old good work that bodies still knew how to do when they had not yet been given up on. The shivering went on for nearly 20 minutes. When it eased, her eyes opened and stayed open, and the color of her face had begun to move from wax back toward human. She looked around the cabin. She looked at the pine-board ceiling and the hanging kerosene lanterns and the low-beamed doorway to the kitchen. And then she looked at Jax Harlan, and something in her face moved. "I know you," she said. Jax did not say anything. "You're the man on the ridge," she said. Her voice was thin. "The stove man." She said the words without any of the heat that the men at Dunlap's feed had always put into them. She said them the way a person says the name of a landmark they have driven past every day for a year and never quite noticed until now. "Yes, ma'am," Jax said. "I'm sorry." Her eyes shut. "I'm sorry." "Nothing to be sorry for," Jax said. He did not ask her what she was sorry for. He did not need her to explain. He had an idea. He got her name on the second cup of warm water. Her name was Clara. She did not offer a last name, and he did not ask for one. She said that she lived in the small yellow house at the end of Birch Lane, down in town, the last house before the county road turned back up toward the hills. She said that her husband was deployed. She did not say where. She said that the power had gone out in her house on the first day of the storm, and that she had stayed in the house for 3 days with the small wood-burning fireplace going, and that she had run out of wood on the morning of the 4th day, and that her phone had died, and that no one had come, and that she had started walking. She did not know where she had been walking to. She did not think she had been walking anywhere in particular. She had walked until her legs stopped carrying her. She was 28 years old. She was 7.5 months pregnant. There was no one she could call. There was no one coming. Jax listened to all of this in silence. When she finished, he stood up from the chair by the stove, and he walked to the window, and he looked out at the valley. The valley was white. The valley was silent. The valley was a collection of small buildings, half buried in new snow under a sky the color of hammered iron. He could see 3 other houses from the window, and one of them had faint smoke coming from its chimney, and the other 2 did not. He could see the dark shape of the Peterson place down by the creek bend, and the Harroway's trailer on the far side of the draw, and the brown single-wide where old Harriet Voss had lived alone since her husband Raymond had died in the summer of '99. None of those chimneys had smoke. He turned back to Clara. Her eyes had closed again, but her breathing was steady, and she was warm now under the wool. She would sleep. The sleep was the body's next stage of repair, and he was going to let her do it. "I need to go out," he said quietly to Smokey. "I need to check the neighbors." Smokey did not move from the woman's back. She looked at him with her amber eyes, and she did not rise. He understood. He nodded once. "You stay," he said. "You stay with her." He put on his second jacket, a heavier canvas coat that had been his grandfather's, and that still smelled faintly of the pipe tobacco that old man had smoked for 50 years. He put on his heaviest mittens, and he pulled a wool balaclava over his face, and he took the snowshoes off the peg by the door, and he strapped them on, and he went back out into the wind. He brought Harriet Voss back in his arms. She was 83 years old, and she weighed 91 pounds in her housecoat, and she had been sitting in her kitchen with a blanket over her shoulders and a cup of cold tea in front of her, and when he opened the door without knocking, she had not even been surprised. She had looked up at him through her thick glasses, and she had said, in the quiet matter-of-fact voice of a very old woman who had made her peace with many things, "Raymond, is that you?" And then her eyes had focused, and she had seen that it was not Raymond. And she had said, "Oh, it is the stove man," and she had put her hand on Jax's arm, and she had let him wrap her in her husband's old wool coat and carry her up the hill. He brought the Petersons in 2 trips. Dean Peterson and his wife Brenda had 3 children between them, 2 boys of 8 and 10 and a girl of 5, and they had been huddled under every quilt in the house in the living room, with a dying fire in the grate. And when Jax knocked on the door, Dean had opened it with his pistol in his right hand, and his eyes red-rimmed from crying, and he had lowered the pistol very slowly when he saw Jax's face, and he had not been able to speak for almost a full minute. By dusk of that 5th day, there were 7 people sleeping in Jax Harlan's 20-by-24 cabin, and the rocket stove shed was running full, and the cabin stove was running full, and Jax was moving between the 2, in a quiet steady rotation that looked, to anyone who had not seen it before, like the motion of a man going about chores. It was not chores. It was logistics. He was running a casualty collection point. He had done it before in country. He was doing it again. Roger Halden came at 9:30 that evening. He came on foot through the dark, breaking trail along the fence line the way Clara had broken trail earlier that day, and when he hammered on the cabin door with his gloved fist, the sound was loud and wrong and panicked, and every single person in the cabin flinched. Jax opened the door. He stood in the doorway. He did not step aside. Jax, Roger's voice was high. The Carhartt coat he wore was caked in ice. His face was raw. Jax, listen, my wife is in the house. She has got her oxygen. It runs off electric. Jax, you have to let me bring her up here. You have to. Jax looked at him for a long moment. The snow was blowing sideways across the porch. The lantern behind Jax in the cabin threw a long yellow rectangle of light out across the frozen boards and across Roger Halden's ice-crusted boots. How far back is she? Jax said. My truck is down at the county road. I could not get up the hill. I walked. Jax, please. How long has her concentrator been out? All day. All damn day, Jax. Jax looked past Roger at the wall of snow moving in the dark. He thought about the distances. He thought about the sleds in his shed. He thought about the 400 yards of unbroken trail between the county road and his cabin door, and the wind direction, and the temperature, and the weight of a 60-year-old woman on oxygen in a cold that was killing her faster than she could know. Go inside, he said. Tell my dog to stand down. Tell her it is Jax. She will let you by. Sit down. Drink the water on the stove. Do not bother the pregnant woman. Do not bother the old woman. Do not bother the children. I will bring your wife. Jax. Roger's voice cracked. Jax, I am sorry for everything Roger. Jax's voice had gone very quiet. We do not have time for any of that right now. Get inside. Warm up. I'm going for your wife. He pushed past Roger Halden into the dark. He did not let himself think about Roger. He did not let himself think about 2 years of stove freak at the feed store, or about the zoning complaints Roger had filed against him in July, or about the developer from Bozeman Roger had walked up the ridge in June, or about any of it at all. A job was a job. The job was to keep a 60-year-old woman with a breathing problem alive through a night that did not want her to be alive. He pulled the small fiberglass sled from the side of the shed. He lashed a folded wool blanket across it with bungee cords. He put his head down against the wind, and he started down the trail toward the county road, and the dark swallowed him in under 10 strides. He brought Margaret Halden back on the sled 3 hours later. She was alive. She was very cold. Her lips were blue, and her breathing was shallow, and she was clinging to consciousness by a thread. But she was alive, and when Jax laid her on the rug by the stove with her face turned toward the fire, the thread held. Smokey came around the stove and lay down against the old woman's side without being asked, and Margaret Halden's hand came out from under the blanket and buried itself in Smokey's thick neck fur, and her fingers closed, and she made a small sound that was not quite a sob and not quite a word, and she kept on breathing. Roger Halden stood by the kitchen door with his hands at his sides and his mouth working silently and his eyes full of something that he would not have had the vocabulary for on any other day of his life. Jax walked past him to the stove. He poured himself a cup of water. He drank it without stopping. Sit down, Roger, he said. All of you sit down. We have work to do, and we are going to do it in shifts. Listen up. 7 people were looking at Jax Harlan now. 7 people were listening to him the way people listen when they have just understood that the man in front of them is the only thing standing between them and the end of their lives. He did not enjoy it. He did not raise his voice. He spoke the way a man speaks in a cold tent at an aid station, quietly and clearly, because confusion in a room like this one killed people just as surely as the weather outside. He laid out the rules. He laid out the watch shifts. He laid out the water rationing and the food rotation and the sleeping arrangements. And he laid out where the outhouse was and how to get to it in the dark without losing the trail. And he laid out what they were to do if anyone started shivering again, or stopped shivering, or stopped being able to speak. And he laid out who would sleep where for the night, and who would tend the fires in the shed, and who would tend the fires in the cabin, and he did all of it in the span of about 7 minutes, and when he was done, no one had a question. The logistics were clean. The logistics were a thing they could follow. The logistics gave them back a piece of themselves that the cold had been trying to take away. Roger Halden sat down on the floor beside his wife. He did not look at Jax. He looked at his wife's face in the firelight, and he put his hand against her forehead, and he began, very quietly, to cry. Outside, the wind rose. The storm came on. The second week was the week the valley began to come apart. The storms kept arriving. They came in pairs and in threes, walking down out of the north one after another without interruption, and the temperature did not rise above 22 below zero at any point during the first 11 days. The radio on the shelf spoke in the flat, synthesized voice of the National Weather Service for 16 hours a day, and what the voice had to say did not change in any meaningful way from one broadcast to the next. Roads closed, shelters overwhelmed. National Guard staging delayed by continued precipitation. 2 elderly residents found deceased in a home in Conrad County. 1 resident found deceased in a vehicle outside Choteau. Governor urges patience. Governor urges patience. Governor urges patience. Inside the cabin, Jax ran his small command on the rhythm of the fire. The fire was the clock. The fire was the calendar. The fire told him when to sleep and when to wake, and when to split the next round, and when to move the thermal mass stone, and when to eat, and when to rest his hands. He did not have a watch on anymore. His watch had stopped 3 days into the storm, and he had not bothered to wind it. Time had given up on being a grid of numbers. Time was now the slow, patient turning of the logs inside the stove, and the slow, patient drift of heat through the river stone of the shed, and those were the only 2 times that mattered. He slept in 2-hour stretches in the chair by the cabin stove. He had not slept in the cot against the north wall since Clara had arrived. He had given the cot to Harriet Voss. The Peterson children slept together on the kitchen floor on a pallet he had made of old quilts and a folded canvas tarp. Dean and Brenda Peterson slept upright against the west wall, shoulder to shoulder, one of them always half awake. Margaret Halden lay on the long settle by the fire with her breathing more even now than it had been on the first night, and Roger Halden sat on the floor at her feet and did not seem to sleep at all, and did not seem to eat unless Jax put the plate in his hands and told him to. Clara slept through most of each day on the rug by the hearth, rolled in Jax's wool blankets, with Smokey tucked against the curve of her spine. The 2 of them had not separated for more than a few minutes since the first day. Where Clara went, Smokey went. Where Smokey lay, Clara slept. Jax watched them without seeming to. He watched them the way he watched everything in the cabin, from the corner of his eye, from behind the rim of a coffee cup, from the angle of his shoulder as he stacked wood beside the stove. He had seen the way Smokey had pressed herself against Clara's back that first night. He had seen the way Smokey's amber eyes had tracked Clara's breathing, minute to minute, for hours on end. Smokey did not do that for everyone. Smokey had lain beside Harriet Voss, yes, but she had come away from the old woman at regular intervals to drink water and stretch out and check the rest of the room. Smokey had not come away from Clara. Smokey had not even tried. Something about it bothered Jax. He could not say what. He did not let himself think about it. There was no room to think about it. There was no room to think about anything that was not the next cord of wood, or the next meal, or the next pass through the trench to the outhouse, or the next radio bulletin, or the next head count. He made the head count every 4 hours, at the top of each fire rotation, the way he had once counted the heads of his squad on night patrol: 7 adults, 3 children, 1 dog, 11 souls, all present, all breathing. The smell began on the morning of the 10th day. It was a thin, particular smell, and it came in with the wind when he opened the cabin door, and it caught him sideways, under the breastbone, in the place where no amount of discipline could ever quite reach. It was the smell of a kerosene lantern that had been burned too hot for too long and had started to smoke its wick. It was not in the cabin that morning, a dangerous smell. He could track it to its source in less than 10 seconds. It was the lantern on the east wall, and the wick needed trimming, and he was going to trim it. That was not the problem. The problem was that his hindbrain had no interest in any of those facts. The problem was that the smell had already reached into a place his hindbrain kept locked, and the lock had opened, and through the open door a number of things were now coming that he had spent 4 years keeping on the other side of it. He stood very still in the cabin doorway, with his hand on the latch, and his breath held. The Korengal Valley, November of his 3rd deployment. A night raid that had gone long. kerosene smoke from a Chinese lantern hanging from a beam in the low ceiling of a mud-walled room. A boy of 19 on the floor with his stomach opened, and Jax's hands inside the wound, pressing a bandage that would not hold, and the boy's name was Corporal Daniel Mercer, and Corporal Daniel Mercer was looking up at Jax with eyes that had already begun to go somewhere else. And he was saying something, and Jax could not hear what he was saying over the sound of his own heartbeat in his own ears. And the lantern was smoking because the wick had not been trimmed since the last patrol. And the smell of the kerosene was sinking into the fabric of Jax's uniform, and into the hair on his forearms, and into the soft, wet meat of the wound under his hands, and Daniel was saying something. Daniel was saying, Jax, Jax, take her home. Take Smokey home, promise me. Promise me you will take her home. Jax came back to the cabin doorway with a full breath of cold air in his lungs, and his right hand braced hard against the doorframe, and his face wet. His face was wet. That part took him a moment to understand. He did not cry. He had not cried in 4 years. He had not cried at the divorce, and he had not cried at the discharge, and he had not cried at the grave that he had driven 1,200 miles to stand beside and then been unable, when he got there, to walk the last 20 feet up the hill to actually see. He did not cry. His face was wet anyway. He wiped it with the back of his glove. He did not turn around. He knew that someone in the room behind him would have seen. He knew that one particular person in the room behind him would have seen, because there was never a moment in the cabin when that particular person was not watching him. Smokey came around the corner of the stove without a sound. She pressed her shoulder against the outside of his right leg. She stood there with her whole weight leaning against him, and she did not look up at his face, and she did not make a single sound. And she put 115 pounds of warm living dog into the side of his leg until the shaking in his hand under the doorframe eased off, and his breathing found its way back to the slow count he had trained it to, and the cabin came back into focus around him as a room in Montana, and not a room in the Corango Valley. He let the breath out. He closed the door. He turned back to the room. Harriet Voss was reading a paperback by the light of the lantern with her thick glasses on the end of her nose, and she had not looked up. The Peterson children were playing a quiet game on the kitchen floor with a set of carved wooden soldiers that Jax had brought down from the attic for them. Dean and Brenda were at the kitchen table, cutting strips of an old sheet into bandage lengths. Roger was asleep sitting up beside his wife, his chin on his chest. Clara was awake. Clara was sitting up against the wall beside the stove, with the wool blankets bunched around her waist and one hand on the low round of her belly. And her dark blue eyes were on Jax's face, and she had seen all of it, and the understanding in her eyes was soft and unsurprised and old. He did not acknowledge her. He could not have. Not then. He walked past her to the stove. He picked up the kettle. He poured himself a cup of water. Mr. Harlan, Clara said. He stopped with the cup halfway to his mouth. He looked at her. Thank you, she said, for letting me stay. Yes, ma'am, he said. He went back outside. He split wood for an hour and a half. The labor started that evening. She had come over to the kitchen table to help Brenda Peterson cut bandages. She had walked slowly across the cabin floor with one hand on the small of her back, and she had sat down on the bench opposite Brenda, and the two women had been folding strips into neat, tight rolls for perhaps 15 minutes when Clara went very still. Her face changed. She put both hands flat on the table. Oh, she said. Brenda Peterson was a nurse. Brenda Peterson had been a nurse in Silver Creek for 19 years, and she had delivered more babies in emergencies than she had hot meals, and Brenda's hand was on Clara's forearm before Clara had finished exhaling. Honey, Brenda said, how long have you been feeling that? About 2 hours. Before that? Since this morning. Brenda looked at Jax. Brenda did not speak. She did not need to. The trigger came at him again about 40 minutes later. It came the same way the first one had come. It came through the smell of the kerosene lantern, and it came through Clara's low bitten-off sounds of pain, and it came through the firelight shifting across the wall. And it came because Jax was looking down at a woman who might be dying, and his hands were not clean, and the bandages were made from an old sheet, and there was no help coming. And all of that was the same set of conditions under which he had knelt in mud on the other side of the world, with his hands inside a soldier's stomach, and watched that soldier die. His vision narrowed. His hearing shrank down to the hollow ringing sound of his own pulse. His fingers, on the edge of the kitchen table, began to lose feeling, one at a time, starting with the thumbs. He stepped back from the table. He did not say anything. He walked to the cabin door. He put his hand on the latch. He was going to go out into the snow, he knew, with the clear, detached certainty that had been a part of his internal weather for 4 years, that if he opened this door and walked out into the storm in his shirt sleeves and kept walking down toward the draw and did not stop, then, in about 45 minutes, the cold would do for him what he had not been able to do for himself, and the terrible pounding inside his chest would stop. He was not going to hurt himself. He was going to let the weather hurt him. There was a difference. There was not very much of a difference, but there was a difference, and it was the difference that his hand on the latch had been arguing with, very quietly, for a long time. Smokey came between him and the door. She did not bark. She did not growl. She came silently from across the room at a speed that should not have been possible for her injured leg, and she put her body across the threshold between Jax Harlan and the door, and she sat down on his boots, and she looked up at him with her amber eyes, and she stayed there. He looked down at her. She did not move. Behind him, Clara Mercer cried out, one short, sharp sound, and he heard Brenda Peterson's low, steady voice saying, "Breathe with me, honey, breathe with me, that is good, that is very good," and he heard the wood pop in the stove, and he heard the wind under the eaves, and he heard the small, dry sound of Harriet Voss turning a page of her paperback, and he heard the whole shape of the room come back around him, piece by piece, as the cold edge inside his head ebbed off the way a tide ebbs. He knelt down in front of Smokey. He put his forehead against the top of her head. She leaned into him. He stayed there for a count of 10. Then he got up, and he took his hand off the latch, and he turned around, and he walked back across the cabin to the kitchen table, and he said to Brenda Peterson, "Tell me what you need." The cabin grew very still. Jax laid Clara down on the rug by the stove. He had carried her there from the kitchen table, and she had not weighed very much in his arms. And he had laid her down on her left side the way Brenda had told him to. And he had slid the folded jacket under her head and the folded quilt under her hip. He had done all of it with a precision that was not the precision of the old combat medic he had been in another life. Not exactly. It was something softer than that. It was the precision of a man who understood that each motion of his hands now was going to mean something to this woman for the rest of her life if she lived through this night. And so each motion had to be correct. Brenda Peterson was at Clara's side, with her sleeves rolled to the elbow and both her forearms scrubbed with the bar of lye soap Jax had brought down from the shelf by the sink. The kitchen twine was on a clean tin plate beside her. The folding knife, which Jax had passed through the flame of a candle for a full minute and then into the boiling water of the kettle for another 2, lay on a second plate beside the first. The oldest, cleanest of the wool blankets had been cut down and laid under Clara's hips. The youngest and softest of them was folded on the hearth by the fire because that was the blanket that the child, if the child came out alive, was going to be wrapped in. It was all of it a field expedient. It was all of it wrong for the situation in the only ways that mattered to a hospital. It was also, Jax understood as he knelt there on the boards beside Clara's head, the cleanest and warmest and most carefully assembled birthing room that was going to be available to her anywhere within 50 miles of the cabin on that particular night. The Petersons had not thought of this. The Haldens had not thought of this. Harriet Voss had not thought of this. Clara herself had certainly not thought of this. Only Jax Harlan, 4 years ago, splitting and stacking his first cord of wood on the ridge behind the cabin, looking out at the valley in July sunshine, had thought about what a room in this cabin might one day need to become. He had not known then that it would need to become this, but he had known that it would need to become something. "Jax," Brenda said without looking up, "here. I want you at her head. I want her looking at your face. I want you to breathe with her. You breathe in when I tell you to breathe in. You breathe out when I tell you to breathe out. She is going to do what you do. Can you do that for me?" "Yes, ma'am." "Good. We are going to do this." Clara's eyes found his face. They had gone very dark in the firelight, the dark blue of deep water. Her hair was stuck to her forehead with sweat, and her lips were pale, and she was beautiful in the specific way that a woman becomes beautiful when every small mask that life has made her wear has been taken off by a pain that will not wait. She reached for his hand with her right hand. He gave her his left, because his right needed to stay free. She took his left hand in both of hers, and she held it against the center of her chest, and he could feel her heart through the thin cotton of her shirt, and it was running hard and fast, and it was holding. "I'm right here," he said. "Breathe with me." She breathed with him. The contractions came in long, patient waves. They came every 3 minutes, and then every 2, and then every 90 seconds. And Brenda talked Clara through each of them in a low measured voice that did not rise, and did not fall, and did not ever stop. Jax breathed with her. He breathed in the count of 4. He breathed out to the count of 6. He counted for her with the small dip of his chin, and she counted with him. And her hands tightened and loosened and tightened again around his left hand. And at some point in the second hour he realized that he had stopped being cold, that the whole cabin had stopped being cold, that the only temperature in the world was the temperature of the small, warm, living circle the three of them had made on the rug beside the fire. It was in the third hour that Clara asked for the jacket. "My bag," she said, between two contractions, with her breath thin. "In my bag, the green one, there is a jacket." Harriet Voss moved without a word. She crossed the cabin with the slow, careful shuffle of an old woman who would not be hurried by anything. She found Clara's green canvas duffel bag where Jax had set it in the corner on the first night, and she opened it, and she looked inside, and she reached in, and her face changed when her hand closed on what it had found. She brought it over to the rug. It was a field jacket. It was an olive-drab army field jacket of the kind that had been standard issue across 2 decades of deployment, worn soft at the cuffs and the collar, with a name tape stitched over the right breast pocket, and the name on the tape was Mercer. Clara took the jacket. She held it against her chest. She pressed her face into the collar of it. She breathed in. Her eyes closed. For a long moment her whole body seemed to ease, the way the body of a frightened animal eases when it is brought back to the scent of its own kind. "Daniel," she said. She said it to the collar of the jacket, and not to anyone in the room. "Daniel, I need you here. I need you here." Jax Harlan's hand in her hand went very still. He did not look at the name tape. He did not need to. He had heard the name already. He had heard the name in her voice, soft and broken and full of the kind of love that only ever belongs to one person and cannot be transferred to anyone else when that one person is gone. He had heard it, and the inside of his chest had gone quiet in a way it had not gone quiet in 4 years, and he understood with a cold, slow certainty that something in the cabin was about to change, and that he was not going to be able to stop it. Smokey lifted her head. She had been lying against Margaret Halden's hip on the settle by the fire for the better part of an hour, with her amber eyes half closed, and her breathing slow, and her old body taking its rest the way an old working animal takes its rest between rounds. She lifted her head off her paws now. She lifted her ears. She rose slowly. The old injury in her left hind leg meant that she rose in 2 stages, the way she always rose, first up onto her front legs and then rocking her weight back onto her hips, and tonight, with the cold of the cabin in her joints, it took her a full 5 seconds to make the full motion. Margaret Halden took her hand out of Smokey's neck fur and let her go. No one told Smokey to move, no one called her. No one spoke. Smokey crossed the cabin floor. She crossed it with a slow, deliberate, unhurried pace, and her amber eyes were fixed on the olive-drab jacket in Clara Mercer's hands, and her nose was working, very gently. As she walked, she reached the rug, she reached Clara. She lowered her head. She pressed her nose into the collar of the field jacket. She held it there. She breathed in. She breathed in for a long time. She did not move otherwise. Her body was entirely still. Only the small, quiet working of her nostrils against the soft, worn collar of her first handler's field jacket showed that she was alive at all. The whole cabin watched. Even Brenda Peterson, who should have been watching Clara, was watching Smokey. Even Clara, between her contractions, had opened her eyes. Smokey drew her nose back from the collar. Her amber eyes closed for a moment. When they opened again, they had gone wet in the way that the eyes of old working dogs sometimes go wet, and there was in them a thing that Jax Harlan had seen only twice before in his life, and both of those times had been in the eyes of human beings standing over graves. Smokey lay down. She lay down along the length of Clara Mercer's body. She laid the full weight of her chest across Clara's chest, and she laid her great silver muzzle along the line of Clara's throat, and she pressed her heart against Clara's heart, and she did not move again. She stayed there with her amber eyes open, and her breathing slow, and her body a long, warm, living blanket across the woman who was carrying the last living piece of Sergeant Daniel Mercer of the United States Army, whom Smokey had loved first, and whom she had not seen in 8 years and 4 months. and whose scent she had just found again in the collar of a jacket on a rug in a cabin in Montana. Clara put her hand on Smokey's head. She did not ask what was happening. She did not need to. Something in the weight of the dog had already told her. Her fingers closed in the thick double coat of Smokey's neck the way her fingers had closed in the collar of the jacket, and the tears began to run down the sides of her face and into her hair, and she did not make a sound. Jax Harlan could not move. He sat on the rug beside her head, with his left hand still in both of hers and his right palm flat on the floor, and the inside of his head was perfectly, entirely, terribly quiet. The name tape he had not let himself look at. The name she had spoken into the collar of the jacket, the green canvas duffel bag in the corner, the particular shape of her brow line and the particular dark blue of her eyes, the address she had given him on the first night, the last house on Birch Lane. He had driven past that house 40 times in 2 years. He had never looked at the mailbox. He had never looked at the name on the mailbox. He had not wanted to know what name would be on any mailbox in this town. He had lived with his head turned away from every name on every mailbox in the valley for 4 years, and now the name had come up the hill in a thin down jacket in a blizzard and had laid itself down on his rug, and he had not recognized it. And his dog, his 11-year-old wounded dog, had recognized it before he had. The contraction came again. Clara bent forward around Smokey's body and she cried out, and Brenda Peterson said, "Push for me, honey. Push for me now. That is your baby. Come on now. Come on." And Jax Harlan's hand was crushed inside both of Clara's hands, and he leaned his forehead down against her forehead, and he counted for her, because that was the job. And the job was not over. The job would never be over. The job had only just come home. The child came at 2:47 in the morning. He came in a rush, and a long, thin cry, and Brenda lifted him up in both her hands, and he was small, and he was blue around the mouth, and his limbs were loose. And for a terrible half-second, no one in the room breathed. Brenda turned him over. She rubbed his back with the rough of a clean kitchen towel. She tipped his head forward. She cleared his small mouth with the tip of her little finger. The child drew in a thin, ragged breath, and then another. And then he opened his mouth, and he told the world what he thought of the world in a voice that was thin and pink and entirely alive, and the whole cabin let its breath out in one long sound, and Harriet Voss, in the chair against the north wall, began quietly to weep. Brenda wrapped him in the soft blanket. She laid him on Clara's chest. Smokey lifted her head off Clara's throat. She looked at the small wrapped bundle. Her amber eyes tracked him, taking him in. She lowered her muzzle, slowly, carefully, in the way that a working dog approaches a very fragile thing she has been assigned to protect. She pressed her black nose against the baby's forehead. She licked him, once, on the soft hair above his brow. The gesture was exactly the gesture she had made once before, long ago, on the worst day of her working life, to a man who could not any longer feel her do it. Only Jax, of all the people in the cabin, knew what that single gesture meant. Only Jax understood that she was taking up a post she had laid down 8 years earlier, and that she was not going to lay it down again. He watched her. He could not have spoken if the room had demanded it of him. Smokey lay back down. She laid her heavy head along the baby's small side. She closed her amber eyes. Her heavy tail thumped softly, rhythmically, exactly once against the cold linoleum floor in acknowledgement, and then she was still. Jax Harlan got up from the rug. He walked, very quietly, into the dark at the far end of the cabin, and he sat down on the floor in the corner between the kitchen doorway and the back wall, and he put his face in his hands. He did not make a sound. His shoulders moved. His shoulders kept on moving for a long time. Clara, on the rug by the fire, held her son against her chest and watched him over the top of the dog's great silver head, and she saw Jax Harlan in the corner, and she did not call to him, and she did not look away, and something in her face, softly, was beginning to understand. It was Harriet Voss who got him up. She came across the cabin very slowly, holding the back of each chair as she passed, and she stopped in front of the corner where Jax was sitting, and she lowered herself onto the small 3-legged stool that stood there. She did it the way an old woman lowers herself onto anything, by degrees and with patience. And when she was seated, she reached out and she put her small dry hand on Jax Harlan's knee. She did not say anything for a long time. Harriet had buried 2 sons and a husband, and had lived alone in a brown single wide at the bottom of the draw for 26 years, and she knew a thing or two about the particular quality of the silence that comes over a man when the center of his life has just been rearranged without warning. She simply sat with her hand on his knee, and she waited, and after a while Jax took his face out of his hands. "She is his wife," he said. "I gathered as much," Harriet said. "I did not know." "No, she has been living down there. In town. The whole time." "Yes," Harriet said. "In the yellow house at the end of Birch Lane. She moved in about 14 months ago. I used to take her some of my preserves in the summer." Jax looked at her. Harriet looked back at him with the watery, pale blue eyes of a woman who had been quietly seeing everything in the valley for 8 decades. "Did you know," he said, "that she was somebody's widow?" "I knew that much." "Did you know about me?" "I knew that he had a friend," Harriet said, "who was supposed to come check on her. That is all I knew." She never said the name. Jax closed his eyes. "I could not," he said. He said it to the floor. He said it to Harriet. He said it to himself. "I could not come. I drove to the cemetery. I got halfway up the hill. I could not walk the last 20 feet. I could not make my feet work. I drove 1,200 miles, and I turned around, and I drove 1,200 miles back, and I did not stand in front of his stone, and I did not ever write to her. I could not, Harriet. I could not." "I know," Harriet said. Her hand had not moved from his knee. "I know you could not. She knows now, too. Look at her." Jax opened his eyes and he looked across the cabin. Clara Mercer was sitting up against the settle now, in the nest of wool that Brenda Peterson had built around her, with her son asleep on her chest and the soft blanket tucked high under his chin. Smokey lay across her legs with her amber eyes half closed. Clara was looking at Jax across the length of the room, and her own face was wet, and there was something in her eyes that was not anger and not accusation. Something older and harder to name. Something like the recognition one soldier gives another soldier at a great distance on a field that they both know neither of them has yet left. She lifted her right hand slowly, and she opened the palm of it toward him, and she did not say anything. Jax got up. He went to her. He crossed the cabin floor with the long, steady stride he had always used, and he knelt beside her on the rug, and he did not know what he was going to say, and when he opened his mouth no words came out. Clara reached out her free hand and she took his, and she pulled his hand gently down onto the small, warm curve of her son's back, and she held it there. "His name is Daniel," she said. Her voice was thin and soft and steady. "Daniel Jax Mercer. I picked it yesterday. I did not know it was you. I just knew it was the name." Jax could not speak. "Daniel wrote me a letter," Clara said, "before the deployment. He left it in the kitchen drawer at the old house in Colorado. He told me if anything happened, I was to open it. I did not open it for a year. I could not. I moved up here first. I wanted the mountains. I wanted to be somewhere quiet. I opened it 4 months ago when I knew I was going to have him." Her hand tightened on his. "He wrote about you. He wrote your name. He wrote that if things ever went wrong for me, if anything ever happened, there was a man named Jax Harlan who had made him a promise, and that man would come. He said you would come." Jax's eyes closed, his jaw worked. He could not look at her. "I did not know it was you," she said again, very softly. "I have seen you in town. I have seen you at the feed store. I have heard them call you things. I never said anything. I was never brave enough to say anything. And I'm sorry for that. I did not know. I thought the man he meant was still back east somewhere. I thought the man he meant had forgotten us. I never once thought, that the man he meant was up on the ridge above my house splitting wood every day for a winter nobody believed was coming." "I am sorry," Jax said. His voice was very low. "Clara, I am so sorry." "You came," she said. He shook his head. "You came," she said again. She pressed his hand against her son's back. "You came tonight. You carried me out of the snow. You built the fire. You kept your dog alive so she could find us. You did the thing he asked you to do. You did it without knowing you were doing it. You did it for 2 years on this hill, Jax. For 2 years." He put his forehead down against the soft blanket over her son's small back. He breathed in. The blanket smelled of wood smoke and milk and clean cotton, and underneath all of that it smelled, faintly, of a jacket that had been folded in a duffel bag for a long time. Smokey laid her muzzle across the top of his hand. Her amber eyes were on his face. Her breathing was slow. He stayed there for a while. When he lifted his head, Clara was looking at him with her dark blue eyes, and she said, very quietly, "He said in the letter that you would be all right. He said it might take a long time. He said the dog would get you there." Jax did not answer. He did not need to. He reached up with his free hand, and he laid his palm against the side of Smokey's silver muzzle. She leaned into it. Her tail thumped once against the floor. The pounding on the door came an hour before dawn. It was a desperate, scraping, panicked sound. The sound of a body that had run out of everything it had and was striking at the last closed door it could find. And when Jax got to the door and pulled it open, the man on the other side was a man he did not at first recognize. The man was bareheaded. The man was bleeding from a long gash along his scalp. The man was a boy of 16, actually, with red eyes and a split lip and a face blue around the mouth, and Roger Halden came up off the floor behind Jax and made a sound that was not quite a word and not quite a scream. And he crossed the cabin in 3 strides, and he caught his son Ethan by the shoulders, and he pulled him into the cabin, and he held him, and Jax closed the door behind them and shot the bolt. Ethan Halden was 17 years old, and he had hiked up from town along the creek, and he had fallen through a thin place in the ice over the beaver dam, and he had climbed out again on the far side because there was no other way. And he had walked the last 2 miles with his jeans frozen solid below the knee, and he had been walking to the cabin because his mother was up here, and his mother had her oxygen up here, and he had not known where else in the world to go. He told all of it in broken sentences with his father's arms around him, and Brenda Peterson had her hands on his pant legs before he was done talking, cutting away the frozen denim with the kitchen shears, because the jeans needed to come off and the feet needed to be assessed. And the clock on the boy's feet, if his feet had gone as wrong as they looked, was going to be short. They saved the boy's feet. They saved them with Jax's largest pot filled with water heated to exactly the temperature Brenda said it needed to be, and with Smokey laid along the boy's legs for her own particular warmth, and with Clara across the room holding her son and crying very quietly and saying nothing, and with Jax Harlan and Dean Peterson and Roger Halden working in the orderly, coordinated silence of 3 men who had, somewhere in the last 10 days, learned how to be 3 men who worked together. Roger Halden was the one who spoke to Jax afterwards. He came over to the chopping block out behind the shed where Jax had gone to stand alone for a minute in the cold at the thin gray first hour of daylight on that 12th day. Roger stood at the other side of the block. He did not take off his gloves. He did not look directly at Jax. He looked at the chopping block. "I cannot give you back any of it," Roger said. His voice was tight and low. "The zoning filing, the things I said in the feed store, the people I sent up here in June. I cannot take any of it back. I am not going to insult you by pretending I can." Jax nodded once. "My boy would be dead," Roger said. "My wife would be dead. I would be dead. I understand this. I am not a stupid man, Jax. I am a lot of other kinds of man. But I am not a stupid man, and I understand what you did, and what she did." He glanced toward the cabin. "What your dog did." Jax looked at him for a long moment. "Roger," he said, "yes, when the power comes back, when the roads open, I do not want an apology from you at the feed store. I do not want a check. I do not want your name on anything in this valley that mentions mine." Roger nodded slowly. "What I want," Jax said, "is for you to go into Silver Creek, and I want you to go to the mayor, and I want you to tell him that Clara Mercer at the end of Birch Lane is the widow of Sergeant Daniel Mercer, United States Army, killed in action. I want you to tell him that she has a newborn son named after his father. I want you to tell him that she has no power and no heat in that little yellow house of hers, and that the town is going to help her. I want you to tell him that I will be splitting the wood. I want you to tell him that the town is going to do the rest. Do you understand me, Roger?" "I understand you," Roger said. "Good." They did not shake hands. Neither of them had been raised in a way that made that possible on a morning like this one. Roger Halden nodded once, and he walked back toward the cabin, and Jax stayed by the chopping block in the gray dawn light with his breath showing in front of his face. And after a minute, Smokey came through the trench and stood at his left heel, and the 2 of them watched the sky in the east begin, very slowly, to turn from gray to something with a color in it. The storm broke on the 14th day. The National Guard rolled up the county road in a convoy of 4 vehicles on the 16th. The power came back in patches across the valley on the 23rd day, and came back the rest of the way on the 29th, and the gas lines thawed out and were repaired by the 35th. and the long, slow return of the valley to its ordinary shape took most of the rest of the winter to complete. The people who had been in Jax Harlan's cabin during the 6 weeks of the blackout did not talk about it very much with people who had not been there. There was nothing to say to those people that would have made any sense, and they all of them understood it, and they all of them let it alone. But they came to the cabin. They came one at a time through the spring and into the summer with small things in their hands. A pie from Brenda Peterson, a jar of preserves from Harriet Voss, a cord of seasoned oak from Dean Peterson, who had driven it up the ridge in the back of his truck without being asked, a carton of new leather work gloves from Roger Halden, left on the porch in the early morning without a note. And on the first Sunday in June, Clara Mercer walked up the ridge road on her own 2 feet, with her son on her back in a soft cloth carrier, and she stopped at Jax Harlan's porch, and she knocked once, and Jax opened the door, and she said quietly, "I brought him to see Smokey." Jax stepped aside. He let them in. By the first week of August, the second rocket stove was finished. Jax built it over 6 weekends at the back of Clara Mercer's small yellow house at the end of Birch Lane. He built it with scavenged steel and a length of 8-inch stovepipe and a heavy plate he drove down to Billings to collect himself, and he built it without being paid, and he built it without being thanked out loud, because the thing between them did not require either payment or thanks any longer. Clara brought him coffee in the mornings and a sandwich at noon, and her small son Daniel Jax Mercer slept in a woven basket on the back porch in the shade, with Smokey lying beside him, the old dog's amber eyes half closed and her heavy silver head tilted toward the basket, her one good ear turning at every small sound the boy made. On the last day, when the stove drew clean and the heat rolled off the new thermal mass exactly as it ought to, Jax stood up from the work, and he wiped his hands on a rag, and Clara came out onto the porch with her son on her hip. And the boy reached out one small pink hand, and he buried his fingers in the thick ruff of Smokey's neck, and Smokey's tail thumped softly, rhythmically, exactly once against the old boards of the porch in acknowledgement. Jax watched them from the yard. He did not say anything. He did not need to. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today.